So what you're seeing behind me here is the 2-column grid layout. This is essentially hands-on practice 8.4. Now, what I have these screenshots here in the back of us. This is pages 282 and 283. So this is where I kind of said it's easier to have the textbook in front of you sometimes. This is one of those places. Now, this is the grid layout that we're seeing here is in replacement of what we saw in 8.2 when we had the order to our flexbox. So you'll remember we had nav, main, and aside, and we had order as the property and 1, 2, and 3 as our values there. So this, on the other hand, is setting up a grid using our viewport. Now, there's a couple of things here to understand, and this is why I wanted to use these screenshots here that you see behind me. So the wireframe is what you see in the upper left-hand corner. Now, the wireframe suggests that, hey, look, if I want to set up columns, so remember the columns go up and down through your page. The line 1 for my column starts at the far side of my viewport. So that's all the way over here. This is where column number 1 starts. Then there's a line a little bit further over, and this starts line number 2, which is where column number 2 starts. And then we have line number 3. That's way over here. And this line is where the page stops. This is where I think it gets a little like, it's not tricky necessarily. It's just, okay, so you're telling me that one line is always the far left-hand side of my browser. Yes. And you're telling me that another line is always the far right-hand side of my browser. Yes, for columns. Now with rows, one line is always the very, very top of your browser. And then another line is always the very, very bottom of your browser. So if I want to have two rather columns, I have to have 3 lines where the first column begins, where the second column begins, and where the end of the page is. That's it. If I want 3 rows going down this way, the first one is the top of the page where the page begins. The second one is where my first row ends. The third one is the bottom of the page where the page ends. So we do that here. You can see, and this is on page 283, that our header takes the following grid row. So it starts on row 1 and it ends with the beginning of row 2. So if you look back over on page 282, sorry, I had to go back over there and look for that, you'll notice that it starts grid row on my grid row number 1, and it stops on the beginning of grid row number 2. So if you look at the wireframe, the very top of my container is 1. So the end of that first row is line number 2. I know it sounds weird. We'll get to play with this in code in just a second so that we can see that. Grid column, so how far across my page, it begins on column number 1 and it ends with the end of column 2, which is line number 3. So if you look again on page 282, you can see that column 1 is the far left-hand side of the page, and column 3 is the far right-hand side of the page. So what we're saying with header is it takes up 1 row and it goes all the way across your screen. Now, if you look at nav, it starts on my row 2 out of 3, and it goes for 1 column over. If you look at main, it starts in grid row 2 out of 3. So you'll see that in the wireframe. And it starts not at the same place as nav does, but instead it starts at 2 out of 3. So you'll see that those grid row, grid columns, as you start to build your elements, you're taking space away from the inside of that wireframe. We're going to go take a look at it over in code here in just a moment, but this is another way to represent your page. And what I will tell you is, and there's a footnote here in the textbook, there are certain people that love this. The brains that do subtraction, so it's the negative area thinking, really do well with this. They're like, yeah, make 3 lines. There's one's the left, one's the right, no big deal. And there's other people who are like, why am I subtracting out the space? So just know which one of the 2 of those that you are and go with that. This, again, is not the only way to code a web page. It's actually one of 5 different ways we see in this chapter that you can flexibly code a web page for responsive design. So we'll take a look at the code here in just a moment, but this is the 2-column grid layout, essentially 8.4.